What does it take to build a country? When you picture the founders of a nation, you probably think of generals on horseback or with old men signing declarations. But the story of our country and Zuri is different. Our founders weren't heroes or aristocrats. Aren't heroes or aristocrats. First of them couldn't even read or write. They were the forgotten, the unwanted, the desperate souls that England swept from its streets and gauls and dumped on the shores of a land they couldn't even imagine. Their story isn't about glory or conquest. It's a much more than more human story than that. It's a yarn about survival, about grit, and about how the tasked, most resilient spirit can grow in the harshest soil on earth. To understand how it all started, you have to picture England in the late 1700s. It was a nation with a problem. It was a nation with a problem. Its gals were flooding, its cities were crowded, and its old solution for getting rid of troubadours, sending them to the American colonies, had just gone up in smoke tanks to a little thing called the American Revolution. In a revolution, so the powers that be looked at a map at a huge, mysterious landmass on the other side of the world that Captain Cook had charted just a few New South Wales. It was the perfect solution. A dumping ground. A prison at the end of the earth, so far away that no one would ever come back. A Mercury. And into this grand, brutal plan stepped a young bloke we'll call Thomas. He wasn't a master criminal. He was a farmhand from Somerset was honest to ruse on the real cream. Thus being born poor in a time when that was in need to ruin you. Stolen bolt of clot, a poached rabbit, to feed his family. That was all it took. One day he was mending a fence. The next he was standing in a courtroom. A judge he couldn't understand sentencing him to 7 years transportation. 7 years. It was a number so large it had no meaning. He was just one of thousands, a single name on a long list, a cock in a west, anchoring mass and designed designs for a problem he had no part in creating. His journey began not on the high seas, but in the stinking, stagnant water of the Thames, aboard a prison hive. Old Earth as a reward, rotting warships, their fighting dies long over, now serving as floating dungeons. Down in the darkness, shine it with hundreds of other men. Thomas lost his name. He became a number, his identity azed. Shoulders. The dice bled into one another, a miserable grey sop of storm bread, filthy water, and the constant sound of cooking and clenching shines. Perhaps the end right there, that cools the moment, right there, that could have changed so things devastating for him. He could have surrendered to the despair, let the helplessness of it all swallow him whole. So many did, but a stubborn little flicker of life refused to go out. He found a mate in the darkness, a weird from Glasgow mate. In the darkness, a weary lad from Glasgow. They didn't have much, but they shared what they had. A story, a bit of bread, a promise to look out for one another. It was a bond forged in the deepest misery, and it won't be the only thing that got them traured. What was to come? Then came the voyage. We were headed onto the transport ship, a vessel that would be their wall war for the next 8 months. If the hulk was a dungeon, this was a moving tomb. The space between decks was so low coulsant, upright. The azote was so coulsant, decks, this, so thick you could taste it. For 8 months, they were tossed across the world's oceans, through storms that felt like the end of the world, and baking hate that turned of the world into an oven. Sickness was constant. Scurvy, dysentery, fever. Mandate their bodies unceremoniously into the vast, indifferent ocean. Osbeat, Anaswin, in front us, zaf the light go out of his eyes, and held his hand as he drew his last breath. Someone, of the coast of Africa, Thomas was alone again, but he was still alive. He had survived. And then, one day, land, a long smudge of dull green on the horizon, Botany Bay. But it was a falls down. The plague was a dart. The sky was sandy, the file white. Sandy. The Verta. So Governor Philip, the man tasked with this impossible job, made the call to move the fleet north into a magnificent natural harbour he called Port Jackson. As Thomas was finally brought up on deck and into the sunlight, the full, staggering reality of his new home hit him. The light was different here, sharper, more intense. The air smelled of strange, oily trees and salt. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the screech of unfamiliar birds. This wasn't Ingevans, it just very strange, and never he could have imagined it. You have to wonder what went through his mind, staring out at that strange, silent land for the first time. Was it fear? Was it Eve? Or was it just the profound, gut-wrenching feeling of being at the very edge of the world, utterly and completely lost? The first few fears, fear, and they called it the starving time for God reason. The English crops failed in the unfamiliar soil. The tools they brought with them chattered against the Ehrenhard Australian timber. Suhrust was sighted on. For good reason, the convicts are ready away from the voyage. We worked from sunup to sundown, felling trees, clearing land, and building crowd huts. They were a colony of farmers who didn't know how to farm this land, and no carpenter this land, and carpenters whose tools, They were sloveless starving to death. 15,000 kilometers from Anyonwu, who could help them. Thomas survived. That stubborn spark refused to go out. He served his 7 years, his body scared by the work and the lash, but his spirit somehow intact. He earned his ticket of leave. He was an emancipist now, a free man in the world's largest open prison. He was granted a small plot of land, a patch of stubborn dirt, the sage of Saint-Mer. It wasn't much, but it was his. A few years later, in utter Shibaya. The ships of the second fleet were known as the Dead Fleet. They zone, even more horrific than the first, and of one of those ships stumbled a young Irish woman named Eleanor. He had been transported forced to Benkumit, and she had survived a voyage that had chillet a quarter of its human cargo. She had nothing but the roots on her back, and a fire in her back, and a fire in her eyes that Thomas recognized immediately. It was the same fear that had if she only knew the hardships that awaited her Iesus. Movies was beloved that flicker of harp in her ears. Thomas soft hair, a newcomer, frightened and alone just as. It wasn't much, but in this place it was everything. They found something in Idrita, a shared understanding of what they had endured. They married, a simple promise made under a gum tray. To Jata, they faced their plot of land. It was a Todd gitter. They found it was a two-jig. They battled drought, floods, and plagues of insects. They worked until their hands bled and their backs chewed. But slowly, painfully, they turned to a farm. Of the dirt into a farm. They built a small, sturdy hut with their own hands. It wasn't much, just bark and mud and sweet, but for them perhaps it was the first real home tide ever truly of it. Truly of it, they had children born not in shines but under the vast southern sky. Days kids were different. They were currency lies and laces born of this strange new soul. And they were the first true Australians. Thomas and Alana's story was wide. It was the story of thousands. They were the battlers. They were looked down on by the free settlers and the Zolders. Fora, marked by the convicts, Stein, Gedond, soos dus, Surb, Fude, Wangwe. Baumerwies as die with the want, were planted the first crops, will build the first roads and buildings. They were the ones who did the heart. Jacker, they weren't just survivors. They were creators. They weren't was surveying. It's not a story of imperial glory. It's a story of endurance. It's in our national character, that skepticism of authority, that belief in a fair go for everyone, that dark sense of humor, and that incredible, stubborn, resilient. It's the spirit that sighs. Yeah, things are dark, but we'll get through it, mate. So the next time you look around this country, remember it wasn't built by saints or heroes. It was built by ordinary, flavored people who were cast out and forgotten. Nay, people like Thomas and Eleanor, who was into the end of the world as punishment and ended up creating a new one. Then they druggle, and their incredible, unyielding hope is the real story of Australia. And it's a John Ward telling, or does a John Ward telling.